So we may not use the full amount of time that we had mentioned on the invitation to 11:15, but we do have a lot of great information for you, and we really want to leave a lot of time at the end for questions if you all have any. So yes, this is Understanding Sexual Assault and Affirmative Consent. My name is Sydney. I am our project manager here at Monarch Services. And thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you, Sydney. And hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Dalia, and I do education and community outreach here with Monarch Services. And we will go ahead and get started. Alrighty, so today's objectives, me and Sydney hope that everyone who attended here today gain an understanding of what the components of affirmative consent is, because there is consent and there's affirmative consent, so we will dive into that. Also understand how consent can be affected by alcohol, and learn more about what sexual entitlement, slut shaming, and victim blaming are, and then understand how, as being a bystander and using bystander intervention, you can make a difference. And then also how to get support for yourself, for someone that you know, or someone that you're working with. If you work either like in social services or with families, youth, other folks, learn how to get that support for them. Alrighty, so what is sexual assault? So basically sexual assault is sexual contact or behavior that occurs without explicit consent of the survivor or victim. And then here are a couple of forms of sexual assault. There's attempted rape, fondling or unwanted sexual touching, forcing the survivor to perform sexual acts such as oral sex, for example, or also the person causing harm, forcing the victim to penetrate their own body. And then, of course, penetration of the victim's body, which is known as rape.
One thing we forgot to say at the start, if you have any questions throughout the duration of this presentation, just throw them in the chat. So
yes, go ahead and pop them in the chat. Alrighty, so what is consent? If I could have everyone type in the chat, or if you feel comfortable in muting yourself, that's perfectly fine as well. And kind of tell us what consent means or what it means to you. Or if you do work with, if you work with like families or youth or things like that, how do you explain what consent is to the people you're serving? So go ahead and put it in the chat or unmute yourself. Either way works. We'll give everyone a few minutes for that.
I got some, oh, yeah, I don't know.
Alrighty, we have consent means active agreement that is informed. Okay, yes. Anyone else? Let's see. Words or over acts indicating freely giving agreement. Lack of resistance is not consent, correct? Okay, somebody sure they have a chart that show the kids with ages as a lot don't realize. Mutually allying or willingly participating in an act. The process is ongoing. Non-coercive consent is agreement, proposal, giving someone permission to do something, agreement to something, whether physical or otherwise, not just the absence of a no, but the presence of a yes. Definitely, definitely. Thank you everyone for sharing. Okay, we have one more. Understanding and accepting willingly a choice to allow or engage in a specific activities which is given freely without fear of punishment between people of equal power related to the relationship in which can be reversed at any time. Yes, definitely. All righty. Thank you everyone who participated. So there we go. All righty. So affirmative consent 101. As some of you mentioned, it can be withdrawn at any time, of course. When consent is withdrawn for any reason, the reason doesn't matter. Sexual activity must stop. Consent cannot be given as the result of coercion, threats, intimidation, or force. Some of you mentioned that. And someone who is passed out or incapacitated from drugs and alcohol cannot consent. And this also goes for both the survivor and the person causing harm or the perpetrator. Consent must be given before participating in sexual activities with others. Yes, if there is no consent, then there is no permission to commence any sexual activity. Okay, so the known definition or the definition we use of affirmative consent is knowing voluntarily and mutual decision among all participants to engage in sexual activity. It can be given with words or actions if those words or actions create a clear permission regarding willingness to engage in sexual activity. Silence or lack of resistance in and itself does not demonstrate consent. As a lot of you mentioned, the definition of consent does not vary based upon a participant's sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, or gender expression. So the main differences between consent and affirmative consent is consent's given only once. It's something one person, quote unquote, gets from another, and it's often given passively, whereas affirmative consent is ongoing throughout the whole sexual experience. It's decided together with the two people, can be taken away at any time, and it has to be given actively and enthusiastically. Sorry for my pronunciation there. So that's the main differences between consent and affirmative consent.
And part of the reason why, we used to teach, consent and going out into the community, and it was kind of the standard for this kind of work, and moving from consent to affirmative consent, because, for some folks, it was kind of like, oh, consent, I've checked off a box, as opposed to really like embodying like the ethos of this is something that is going to be decided together with, two people or more people, depending on the activities, and that it's throughout the entire experience. And so we really want to move away from the idea of like, oh, I checked my consent box, to like, maybe there was something somebody consented to on Tuesday that they are no longer willing to consent to on Wednesday. And it's not just this thing you get from another person, but really an ongoing conversation that you have with the people that you're engaging with sexually.
Alrighty, next we have some myths about rape or sexual assault. These are also common things we see here in our work at Monarch. First one being, there's no reason for a victim not to report being raped to law enforcement. This is a huge myth. There's a billion reasons why people don't report the sexual assault to law enforcement. It can be anywhere from fear of law enforcement. It can be they think it was their fault. It can be that no one's going to believe them. A lot of times survivors disclose to a person, and if that person doesn't react in a very supportive way or kind of makes them feel like it's their fault, so that victim blaming, chances are they're never gonna report again or talk about it again. So it's very important to keep in mind that a survivor, it's a very hard decision to even disclose a sexual assault. So it gets even harder when it comes to reporting to law enforcement. The next one we have is victims provoke sexual assault situations when they dress provocatively or act in a promiscuous manner. This is a huge myth as well. It's victim blaming. There's no reason why somebody should sexually assault another person. It doesn't matter, if the person's walking naked down the street, for example. No one has the right to touch them or harass them with words or with sounds or sexually assault them. It is not sexual assault if it happens after drinking or taking drugs. It most definitely is sexual assault if there's still alcohol and drugs involved. Being unconscious or passed out and not being able to give consent does not give the other person the right to take advantage of that. Most sexual assaults are committed by strangers. It is not rape if the people involved know each other. This as well, another big myth. We hear it often at Monarch a lot of times. Um, I'm going to use the example of women because that's who tends to, disclose most often to Monarch, especially if they're married. So if they're married to their partner, they feel that since it's their husband or their wife, their partner, that it's not rape, even though they didn't want to engage in sexual activities or stuff like that. But it is rape. Even if you're married to that person or you've been with that person for who knows X amount of years, it's still rape. And just another one is that 2/3 of cases are of sexual assault. The person causing harm is somebody the survivor knows. So it's a very high number that the person who raped someone does know them. And then the next one we have is women falsely accuse men of sexual assault. This is a big myth as well. It also comes from the mindset of thinking that, or society putting it on women that, they tend to be liars or things like that. But also, it's very rare for this to happen. It's like anywhere around from like 3% to 7% of all cases are a false accusation per se. So this is not very common. Like I mentioned earlier, it takes a lot for somebody to even disclose being sexually assaulted. So let's stay away from that. All of these myths. Men cannot be sexually assaulted. Of course, that's another myth. Men can be sexually assaulted. Anyone can. I used to work in the crisis intervention team with Monarch. So I was the case manager there. And that's kind of where we do a lot of like the advocacy and peer counseling and stuff like that. And in my time in that role, I had like about 5 male clients. So and they were all sexual assault. So that is a very big myth that we need to steer away from. If it's hard, for anyone to disclose, it gets even harder when it comes to men or those who identify as men to disclose sexual assault. And the last one, if a person is aroused when they are assaulted, then it's not really sexual assault. This myth right here, even clients at times themselves feel this way. So it's very important for us as support people to let them know that, we're human, our bodies react to certain things. And if there was no consent, if you didn't want to, then it is sexual assault, even if it felt good per se, or if your body did something that you weren't expecting for your body to do. And this myth in particularly, as I mentioned, a lot of times clients feel like it was their fault because they felt, it felt good or it felt a certain way for them. So it's very important to steer away from these myths right here.
Thank you, Dahlia. And we have a question in the chat about our previous slide around like the distinction between consent and affirmative consent. And so the question is, would a consensual transactional sex like sex work fall under the definition, the first definition and not the second, so under consent and not affirmative consent? And that really depends on the situation. So for instance, if there is somebody who is, a commercial sex worker and they agree to have, let's say oral sex with a client and they've been paid for that. And then the client says, oh, I would like to also have penetrative, penile vaginal sex, and they pay for that and the sex worker is comfortable with that, then that would still fall under the umbrella of affirmative consent because they are agreeing together to continue different activities together in an ongoing conversation. It's not necessarily a box checked, but if there is, kind of more, okay, I've purchased this for the night and I'm going to do, whatever I want, that is more consent or in some cases, sexual assault if the sex worker is like, no, I don't want to do these things, or I did not agree to these things. So it really depends on the situation, but transactional sex work can also be within the affirmative consent category, depending on the conversation being had between the sex worker and the person, the buyer, or the John, the customer, whatever they, term themselves. So I hope that answers that question. And I want to see, oh, awesome. Perfect. So we will keep going. Thank you for that question. That's a good one. And so now we're going to kind of talk about how often sexual assault occurs in the United States specifically. And so one of the things that to always kind of think about when we're talking about the numbers of people who have been sexually assaulted is that often these numbers are super duper underreported, because as Dahlia said, there's a lot of reasons why people may not feel comfortable going to the police, going to law enforcement, why they may not feel comfortable reporting what's gone on for them. And so it's just really important for us to remember that this is one of the most underreported crimes there is. And it's even more underreported when we take into account men and boys, because we have a lot of stereotypes around who can be sexually assaulted. And so this is a little bit old there. We need some updated statistics, but this was in 2017, 2018, where incarcerated individuals, so there were over 80,000 incarcerated individuals who were sexually assaulted or raped. And oftentimes when we think about rape and incarceration, we think about two, incarcerated individuals, but more often than not, unfortunately, we are seeing that rape is happening, or that sexual assault is happening from the guards who have been entrusted to take care of these individuals against the incarcerated individuals. And so that's something to keep in mind. There's, no such thing as consent between a guard and an incarcerated individual because of the power differential, and oftentimes guards will take advantage of that. So unfortunately, sex and incarceration is a huge problem, especially given the fact that in the United States, we have like the highest incarcerated population of any country. So it becomes a huge issue here. We have over 61,000 children who were victims of substantiated or indicated abuse. So basically meaning that children who were, either we know for sure that they were sexually abused, or it's highly likely that they were sexually abused, but they just haven't disclosed that. In the general public, almost 300,000 people, 284,000 Americans, 12 and older, so that's not even accounting for those under 12, were sexually assaulted or sexually abused. And then in the military, we know that military rapes are another huge issue, almost 19,000 people experiencing unwanted sexual contact. And because of the unique structures of the military, it makes it that much harder for a survivor to come forward or to get any real justice when it comes to that system. And so just for you to get kind of a sense of us in Santa Cruz County, so Monarch Services, we in the last year have served over 500 survivors of sexual assault. And what we saw in COVID was initially, kind of a decline of sexual assault in our county initially in that first like 3 to 4 month period, and then an increased rise because people, something we don't always talk about is in domestic violence relationships, there can often be sexual assault where the person who's causing harm or using abuse sexually assaults the survivor. And so in those cases, the survivors have been stuck at home with their abusive partners now for well over a year. And so we're seeing an increase in sexual assault support services that we're providing. And we have over 1,700 sexual assault calls come through our crisis line. So this is a big issue even in our county. We're kind of doing more work on sexual assault now than we had even a year ago or 2 years ago prior to COVID. And so who's at risk? So we know that pretty much anybody can be at risk for sexual assault. However, youth tends to be at an increased risk and increased vulnerability of sexual assault. So the vast majority of sexual assault survivors are under the age of 30. We see that biggest age range of over 50% of sexual assaults occurring in people who are aged 18 to 34. In part, that's because we know that for women and for trans and gender non-conforming individuals, they are at the highest likelihood of being sexually assaulted when they're in that college-aged window of 18 to 22/24. We see that for women in particular, a lot of women end up being sexually assaulted even in their first year and their first semester of college because of the unique vulnerabilities, the drinking culture, things like that. We also see that, the next largest chunk is, a wider age range, 28% from the 35 to 64 age range. And this is in part because these folks have a little bit more experience in knowing how to maybe engage in bystander intervention, which we're going to talk about. And maybe, having more experience of the world, more experience with alcohol that protects in some ways from being sexually assaulted. And that children are often sexually assaulted as well, 12 to 17. We don't have too many statistics on the under 12 set, but we do know that's happening. We do work with childhood sexual abuse survivors at Monarch Services. And then 3% over the age of 65. But again, that could be very underreported, particularly when we take into account how vulnerable elders can be if they're living in assisted living facilities. So I want to check the chat. I don't know if there's any questions in the chat. It's hard to see when you're sharing your screen, but I'll move on. And so who can't consent? So, Dahlia talked a little bit about this, but it's important to really kind of understand who can't give consent. And so individuals who are incapacitated by drugs and alcohol cannot give consent. We unfortunately oftentimes hear the myth around, oh, well, that person was drunk, so they're asking for it, or something really horrible like that. And understanding that if somebody is drunk, if somebody is incapacitated, if somebody's slurring their words, stumbling, all that stuff, that they can't give consent. And we really need to educate the youth around that, because for a lot of, kids who are underage who maybe are now just starting to experiment with alcohol don't always fully understand how alcohol can impact like sexual assault dynamics. And something that's very interesting that we've seen is that for drugs and alcohol, the person who is violating the consent, the person who's causing harm, is often times drunk or, has been using alcohol and drugs at a far greater rate than the person who winds up being victimized. So we have kind of this victim blaming narrative around like, oh, you shouldn't have been drinking or you shouldn't have gotten incapacitated. But really what is the real truth of that matter is that the person who's causing harm is far more likely to have been using alcohol, and alcohol is far more likely to lower a person's inhibitions, creating a situation where they may feel more comfortable to violate another person's consent than, create, a victim situation. So something to keep in mind. Minors under the legal age, so under 18 years old, cannot consent. It's really important that we kind of, myth bust this narrative. And I think that thankfully society is kind of moving more towards really understanding that a minor cannot consent. But, we have for a long time had narratives around like, oh, well, it was just a statutory rape, like this person wanted it, or they, were engaged in the relationship, and really understanding that that's not a true situation. If there's an adult in this situation, the onus is always on the adult to stop any kind of situation, not engage sexually with a minor. A person who is unconscious or who's passed out obviously cannot give consent. And that's something that we see, unfortunately, a lot in our work. People who have been sexually assaulted after passing out at a party or, passing out on a couch or, being unconscious, and somebody takes advantage of them and sexually assaults them. And then this last one, I want to make sure that, it's not misconstrued, but a disability that makes a person unable to give consent. So here, disability, I don't want to say that people who have disabilities cannot consent. That's very ableist, and that's not the truth of the matter. A cognitive disability is very different than a physical disability, or even a learning disability or things like that. So when we're talking about disability, we're specifically talking about disabilities that create a situation where a person cannot give consent. So this isn't, oh, somebody's a wheelchair rider, but rather somebody is, in the throes of active psychosis, probably can't give consent. So making sure we understand that distinction, because we also want to move away from the idea that that disabled people don't have full sexual lives and are able to be sexual and have their sexuality confirmed or affirmed. But so with this one, just be kind of cautious that we're not conflating all disability with the inability to give consent, because that is harmful to disabled persons, but that this is specific about disabilities that create the inability to understand what consent is and to give it freely and willingly. So I'm going to see, are there any questions in the chat?
We have a few comments.
Okay, yeah.
We do have someone who is a active Army victim advocate. So they were saying if there's any questions around that kind of stuff, they'll try to answer to the best of their ability.
Cool.
And then we have someone who said their consent rules are a bit different where they're at. They think they're in BC.
Oh, and British Columbia, I believe. Well, maybe. But awesome. Okay, cool. That's good to know. I mean, yeah, and consent laws and rules are different in different places. And there's places in other countries where I believe the age of consent might be 16 or something like that. Here it's a little different. And so kind of keeping that in mind, if you are from other places, kind of keeping in mind your consent laws, but the kind of overarching umbrella of what affirmative consent is, I think still translates. But awesome, good to know. It's always great to have people from different areas in our webinars. So thank you for being here.
Yes, definitely.
Okay. So consent and alcohol. So this is a big one that we like to cover. We do a lot of work with law enforcement around trying to train them to effectively work with survivors of, well, all of the things we work with. We here at Monarch see survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking. But I've gone to presentations with law enforcement where I will say to law enforcement, what do you think of when you think of sexual assault? Or what do you think of when you have to go out on a sexual assault call? And oftentimes there are groans, there's like, oh no, please, I don't want to have to deal with that. And often, because especially where we are in Santa Cruz prior to COVID, it's a college town. And so a lot of the violations of consent that we see involve alcohol. And so it's really important to myth bust the like, he said, she said, or they said versus they said kind of consent and alcohol situations. So when communicating with youth or whomever you work with, the survivors you work with, kind of understanding things to consider when sexual activity with someone who's been drinking. We try to really educate the youth on this. And as a lot of you here probably work with youth, I think it's really a good idea to have this conceptualization when you are talking with them about these topics. And so things that we ask the youth to consider, or really anybody, adults as well, is, can this person communicate clearly? If the person's slurring their words, if their speech is super disjointed, is incoherent, person's probably pretty inebriated. Are they sober enough to know what's happening? That's a huge one that, people aren't always even sober enough to know exactly what's going on, especially in a college town like Santa Cruz, where folks maybe have left the house for the first time, left their parents' house for the first time, and are experimenting with drinking, experimenting with drugs in a way where they don't know how their body reacts, what's too much, what's, not enough, all that. Are they coherent? So that really goes back to like, can this person communicate clearly? Are they coherent? Do they know where they are? Do they know who you are? And if the answer is no to any of those, we tell kids, do not continue with sexual activity with this person. And that includes adults too, like knowing that for folks who might be really intoxicated, sexual activity should not continue. So statistics to consider. So I talked a little bit about this, but so 50% of sexual assaults occur when the perpetrator is intoxicated. So the person who's causing harm has been drinking, and it, kind of can lower that person's inhibitions to do things that they maybe wouldn't do while they were sober. And most sexual assaults, over 50%, happen in the home of the survivor. So that also gets at what Dahlia was saying around, we have this myth of like stranger danger. Like anybody who was, I feel like, alive in the 90s heard like stranger danger and, you know, all these kinds of things. But the vast majority of sexual assaults, over 2/3, happen, the perpetrator is somebody that the survivor knew. So that could be a romantic partner, a family member, a friend, an acquaintance. So oftentimes these are happening in the home of the survivor because the person who is sexually assaulting them might be a partner, a family member, or somebody that they know well. And so that's something to really kind of consider when we are doing this kind of education and understanding what goes on in the dynamics of a sexual assault and in the dynamics of consent, because it really is not that kind of like boogeyman stranger next door. That does happen to people, but that is more of the rarity and less of the thing that happens most of the time. And I didn't know if, was there any other questions in the chat, Dahlia?
No.
Okay. So sexual entitlement and consent. This is a big one. We don't talk about it enough. I think people have in their mind the lexicon now of victim blaming, slut shaming, a little bit more, but we don't really talk about sexual entitlement. So sexual entitlement is the idea that a person is entitled to or has the right to have sex with another person, regardless of the other person's wants. So this is kind of the idea that, you know, we are like, I want to have sex with you, like full stop, blank, you know, not really considering that the other person is an active participant in this activity. Sexual entitlement may make us feel that our feelings of arousal must be acted on with another person. This is a huge one. I think adults don't always know this, but really teenagers do not always know this, that just because you're sexually aroused by another person, like, and wanting to have sex with them, that does not mean that those feelings of arousal have to be acted on. You know, I was at a really great training back when I was in college, where the presenter was like, you know, there's always masturbation. There's always another way to, you know, kind of meet the needs of those sexually aroused feelings. You do not have to enact your sexual feelings with another person. And we don't always teach that to teens. And we have kind of a culture with movies and media and things like that, that kind of make it seem like, oh, if I want to have sex with this person, I should have sex with this person and not just go get my needs met solo by myself. And sexual entitlement is not about just deciding to do sexual activity together in the same way at the same time. So this can look like thinking you have the right to sex even when another person's uninterested. Thankfully, we're getting away from some of these cultural milieus around, like, you know, if someone's uninterested, you keep trying until you wear them down, which kind of used to be the way in which we taught, especially boys, to engage with somebody. Like, oh, if a girl doesn't like you, just keep trying. Whereas now we're like, oh, maybe leave that person alone, you know? And so sexual entitlement was that kind of old milieu of just keep trying, even if the person's uninterested. Feeling like others are keeping sex from you because they aren't interested. This is one we've seen happening a lot on the internet, like different kind of forms of media. Back in the day, I want to say it was maybe 2018, that you know, Santa Barbara Isla Vista shooter who, you know, killed several women, and we've had so many since then, who was like, oh, I'm killing these women because they are uninterested in sex with me. And so feeling like, you know, something's being kept from you, you know, the term being in the friend zone kind of falls into this, this dichotomy of language, where feeling like, oh, if I'm in the friend zone, you're keeping sex from me, as opposed to being like, okay, we're just friends and this person isn't sexually interested. Thinking someone should want to have sex with you because you want to have sex with them. Again, the idea that, you know, we're entitled to being sexual with another person. And so where do we learn these messages of sexual entitlement? I think this is a really important thing, because we can teach you can teach the students, youth, adults that you all work with. So a lot of media images of men and women, these images kind of reinforce the idea of, men as pursuers of sexual activity, women as gatekeepers, and in that almost completely erase trans and non-binary individuals, and also usually erase queer individuals as well. So we learn that certain people are entitled to sex, i.e. cisgender, heterosexual men and women, usually attractive, full, able-bodied, narrow window of who is entitled to sex kind of depictions in the media, with the erasure of everybody who does not fall into that defined category. We also have, pornography that views gender as inherently sexual, while that views some genders as inherently sexual while viewing other genders as submissive. So again, a lot of people get an inordinate amount of information from pornography because we do not have comprehensive sex education in our country, at least. And so having that setup where men are the pursuers again, and women are like the gatekeepers, and usually in kind of mainstream porn, everybody else is left out. And then sexual norms around who initiates sex. It's still very much the norm in our society for men to be, initiators of sex, or to be billed as the initiators of sex, and women to not have that role. And if a woman is more initiating sex, then she gets kind of labeled with all these icky labels like, slut, all those kinds of things that happen, that does not happen when men are the pursuers of sexual activity. Okay, so asking for consent. It's really important that we have the language of asking for consent, because oftentimes when youth ask us, like, how do we do this? Like, it feels, some people might even say like, oh, it feels awkward to ask for consent. Like, well, then if it feels awkward, then maybe we're not doing it right, or maybe we're not in a point where we feel comfortable enough to be engaging sexually with this person. That just might be something to kind of think about. But, something we really want people to pay attention to is paying attention to body language and nonverbal cues. Was somebody super, super into it, and now they're kind of more withdrawn, they're looking away, they're not, kind of making verbal, verbal confirmations of their interest. Asking things like, how do you like blank, or does this feel good, or how about we try, whatever the case may be. So kind of having a conversation about it. Really telling their partners it's okay to change their minds. We really need to drill this into people, that it is okay to change your mind, that you can start having sex with another person, you can be in the situation, everyone's nude, penetration has occurred, and you're like, actually, I'm over it, I don't really want to do this anymore, and that's totally okay. And being able to communicate to people that it is always okay to change our minds. And then checking in periodically to make sure that the partner or partners are enjoying the activity, which goes back to, does this feel good? How about this? So really asking for consent in a way that normalizes it. And I think for us as adults, really kind of normalizing that, these things can even be things that we didn't always learn. Like a lot of adults, went to schools. Like I know that I went to a school, I'm not that old, but when I was in high school, we were played like a bunch of videos off of Lifetime, Truly, that were kind of slut shamey and very much like, don't have sex before you're married. And this was a public school in Los Angeles. And so we don't really get consent education in the way that would be useful. So then as adults, we have a hard time communicating these things to the youth that need it. And so kind of keeping that in mind. Okay, so victim blaming and slut shaming. So I think a lot of people know what these are, but I think we really need to understand them in the context of how they can, make us unaware of the consent dynamics that are happening. So what is victim blaming? So victim blaming is holding the victim of a crime accountable for the crime. So this creates a situation where survivors are blamed for being assaulted. So if they didn't want to be raped, they shouldn't have been drinking, or they were asking for it by wearing that outfit. It ignores that the person who should be held accountable for the crime is the perpetrator. An example of this outside of the realm of sexual assault is anytime a Black person is killed by a police officer, it's always, what were they doing? What were they wearing? They stole something. They, had a record a million years ago. We blame the victim. And this is very, very similar to what is happening in sexual assault, where if somebody is drinking at a party with a bunch of, the opposite gender and they get assaulted, everyone's kind of like, well, you were asking for it, or like, why did you do that? You chose to do that. In April, we have, I believe it's April 28th, we have Denim Day, where, part of the Sexual Assault Awareness Month, which April is Sexual Assault Awareness Month, if you didn't know. We wear denim on Denim Day because a woman's sexual assault, this was a case in Italy a while ago, was thrown out of the courts because she was wearing tight denim jeans when she was assaulted. And the idea of, oh, well, you couldn't have been assaulted if you were wearing that outfit, it wouldn't have worked. Like, so women are blamed or minimized on both ends. If you're wearing a short skirt and a tube top, oh, you were asking for it. If you were wearing an outfit that's deemed, hard to get off, oh, this didn't happen to you. So victim blaming is kind of at the crux of how we refocus what has happened to somebody on them. And it's also something that happens in our society a lot, where women also victim blame other women. And part of that comes from the idea of self-protection. If you did something wrong, if you wore the wrong outfit, if you behaved wrong, then I can avoid that, and therefore I can avoid being sexually assaulted. And we really want to get away from that thought and away from the idea that you do something to incur violence against you. And this is any kind of violence. This is police violence. This is assault. This is transphobic violence. This is homophobic violence, as well as sexual assault and gender-based violence. You existing in your body does not incur somebody to abuse you or to cause harm against you. And so then we kind of go into slut shaming, which is a form of victim blaming. So this is shaming someone for engaging in sexual activity or dressing a certain way, or even enjoying sex. We see a lot of sex workers who have been sexually assaulted, and slut shaming always comes up. Oh, well, you were selling it and so you just got robbed, versus like, oh, you were engaged in an affirmative consent situation before when you had that transactional sex and that was taken away from you, and now it's sexual assault. And so victim blame or slut shaming really does kind of equate sex with being bad or dirty. If you like having sex, if you like dressing maybe more provocatively, it's also California, it's about to be summer, if the skirts come out, the dresses come out. If we're in that zone, then what we're kind of saying is to be sexual in a certain way is bad, and you should be harmed. The harm that you get from that is your fault. So it is a form of victim blaming. And all across I believe the world now, they have, in the summers, they've had slut walks where sex workers and sex positive folks will kind of get together in various forms of dress and really kind of highlight that being sexually active, being a sex worker does not mean that you are just someone can just abuse you, that someone has the right to sexually assault you. So really kind of taking in that this is a key part of the kind of greater rape culture, the greater culture that we have that allows for a victim to be blamed and for the harm to be put far more on the survivor of sexual assault than the person who is doing the sexual assault. So I want to stop here and see if there's any questions in the chat, because I can't see the chat right now.
We had someone share that they were working with a girl who was a survivor. A number of times she would often get into scary situations, mostly due to the history of her trauma. And after a few times, people started minimizing it or even making it seem like it was not, like she was not really being assaulted. And that does occur. In my own personal experience, being case manager with the CI team, as I mentioned, I was working with a client who was actually incarcerated, because we do counseling in custody. And she had had a few safe exams done, which they're basically also formally known as rape kits exams. And she had had a few within a year. She had been exempt a few times. So because of that, a lot of times her reports weren't being taken very seriously. And it's a shame to see that kind of behavior from those who should be helping. Definitely.
Yeah, we've seen that oftentimes, we've worked with people. I once was at a safe exam with a person who was a sex worker, commercial sex worker, and she had been sexually assaulted by someone who, a few days prior had been a customer. Then in this situation, didn't pay her, did things to her that she did not consent to even prior when he had paid. And, we had the exam. And, I remember in that moment, so we work with officers, like I said, and the officer was kind of like, well, this isn't really going to go anywhere because she's a sex worker. So kind of the slut shaming that her sexual assault wasn't valid because of her chosen profession. And we see that often, and it allows for, right now we live in a society where only about 3 to 5% of people who rape another person ever see a day in jail for it. And, we can have all kinds of conversations about, is incarceration the best way to deal with anything? But at the end of the day, there's no justice or punishment for the people who are causing harm, especially around sexual assault. So it's really important for us to kind of understand how slut shaming really makes it so that the person who's causing harm, the person who's assaulting another person, kind of can get away with it. Okay, and so now we're going to talk about what we can do. So I'll start this, and then Dahlia will kind of, go into more of what they all look like. But so being an active bystander, so, we talk a lot about this happening. How can we change the situation? It's not just deterministic that if someone decides, oh, I'm going to rape this other person, and we just can't stop that train from going off the tracks. We can. And so if you see someone's consent being violated, there's ways we can intervene. We call them the 3Ds. So distracting, being direct or just direct, and delegating. And so Dahlia can go more into these.
Alrighty, so first we have the first one, distract. So it's basically creating a distraction such as spilling a drink or doing other things to draw attention to you. And this gives the non-consenting person a chance to get away or get to a safe person. And a clear example I can think that I've shared with the youth that we work is like, let's say you're at a party, right? And you see that someone's kind of, there's somebody trying to be all over them, and you see they're uncomfortable and things like that. You can easily, just walk by and like spill your drink on that person and be like, oh, hey, like, let me help you get cleaned up, and then just take them away. Or you drop it on the potential person who can cause harm or is causing harm at that point, and do the same thing, be like, oh, my bad, like, sorry for spilling my drink on you. And then that creates a distraction to kind of intervene on that thing that you're seeing that the person is uncomfortable in. So that's some examples of how you can distract if you're in a social setting, or if you're like, let's say, out and about on a walk or something, and you kind of see someone being uncomfortable around the person they're with. You can always do a distraction to kind of get that attention drawn away from that person. Of course, everybody has different ways of being of doing these, but if you're a person who feels comfortable doing this distract method, please go ahead and use this one, but we'll get into the other two. Being direct, this is being straight up being direct. It involves directly going up to the people involved in the situation. And it could literally be you pulling that someone away and being like, no, they're intoxicated. Like, they're not going to go home with you. If it's your group of friends and you notice that your friend is very intoxicated, or maybe they're not fully aware of what's going on, you directly go and get your friend and say like, no, if you're truly interested, like, what's your number? She or he could call you later, or something like that. And this is the most immediate way to help a non-consenting person to get to safety, being direct, and just, intervening right then and there. Again, not everyone's comfortable with being direct or putting themselves in that type of situation, and that's perfectly fine. That's why there's distraction, or that's why there's the next one that we're about to see. Delegate. So this is where you ask another person. It could be another friend, it could be the bartender, the waiter, the bouncer, whoever, wherever setting you're at, to intervene. So you notice that something's going on, but maybe you're not comfortable being direct, or you're not sure how comfortable you are causing a distraction. So you delegate. So you basically advocate, and you have someone else step in that can have that directness. And you tell them what you've seen and what your concerns are, and they'll step in to get that non-consenting person to safety.
Yeah, and these are things that really, kind of communicating to young folks and to ourselves as well, that, there are ways to intervene, there are ways to help, a friend or a situation. And it really is kind of, especially when it comes to, maybe situations out at, like, bar, obviously these things are closed now, but they're opening back up, but like bars, restaurants, even at a party, a club, where it really is, being able to get somebody else involved, even somebody with like a little bit more authority, like a bouncer, like the bartender, it can be helpful in, kind of getting that survivor to safety. Oftentimes, we call this bystander intervention, but we think about the bystander effect, where, people see a bunch of things, like something happening, a bunch of people see it happening, and then no one says anything, because the assumption that somebody else will say something, that somebody else will step in. And so when we kind of move away from that thought to like, no, I need to be the person to say something or step in or get resources, then it kind of diffuses that bystander effect, because we know the bystander effect is also, powerful in the opposite. So if a bunch of people stand around and do nothing, then, it's kind of like almost unspoken that it's okay to do nothing, that it's, somebody else's problem. But when even one bystander steps in, then that emboldens other bystanders to like, no, this is wrong, I need to step in as well, and kind of create a more powerful effect. So we really want to create active bystanders, who aren't just kind of being like, oh, that's somebody else's problem, but looking at it as something that all of us have the power in stopping and in changing. I think there's something like 30 people on this call right now. And, even if each one of us kind of stepped in a situation where something was happening that didn't seem on the up and up, that didn't seem consensual, or even just educating one other person about the 3Ds, then that right there is 30 to 60 events of violence that could potentially be, just nipped in the bud, because we now have this education and this information.
Yeah, definitely, Sydney. And I also want to add that it's important to get to know which one you're comfortable doing. Like me, myself, I'm comfortable being direct or a distraction, but there's other folks that prefer to do the delegate and get somebody, like Sydney mentioned, maybe somebody who feels like they have more authority or something like that to help out. So it's also important to kind of think about, well, which one would I be comfortable with? Or when you are educating others, or youth especially, letting them know, like, ask yourself, which one are you comfortable with doing if you're in a situation like so?
Yeah, and a good one with the delegating is if there's no, like, authority person like a bartender or anything like that, that really bold friend that has no problem, speaking their mind is always a good person to go to when it comes to delegation. They usually get it done.
Alrighty, so where to get help? These are resources here in our county, in Santa Cruz County in California. So of course there's us, Monarch Services. We do have a 24-hour confidential crisis line or hotline that's bilingual in Spanish and English. And it's available, like I said, 24 hours a day. Anyone is welcome to call. Age doesn't matter, gender, not, anyone, literally anyone. You can call if you're on a crisis, or if you simply have a question, or you need a resource, or maybe you're in another part of the world and you need a resource for somebody who's, maybe in our area or near our area in our surrounding counties. our advocates are all trained, to provide resources, to provide advocacy and all that good stuff. So that's available. There's also the Survivors Healing Center here in our county. Then we have the Resource Center for Nonviolence, and then we have the Diversity Center. So these are all resources here in our county that specifically do work healing or advocacy or things like so for survivors of sexual assault. And I think we have something. Okay, we have a question, I believe. I'm in the UK, but interested to know, are bar staff in the US given any training in how to deal with these situations?
So that's a great question. It really is unfortunately very individualized. So some bars are very good at that kind of training or information. Other bars, not so much. A few years ago, we had a coaster campaign, and when the bars open up, we're going to try to do this again, where we provided the major bars in our area with coasters with our information on them, as well as like basically bathroom posters to put up in their bathrooms with like our number that they could pull off if they were in a bad situation. And through that campaign, we saw that some bars were very, very receptive to wanting more training, to wanting to be involved in the coaster campaign. And there were other bars that just flat out refused. And because we work with the sexual assault survivors, we do the SAFE exams. We saw that the bars that kind of flat out refused were also bars, unfortunately, where a lot of our survivors were being assaulted. So it really is very individualistic. It'd be lovely if we could have a more like statewide or even countrywide kind of standard for that, but it just depends on the individual bar and if the bar owners and bar staff are passionate about this topic. Thankfully, though, it feels like more and more of this is getting out there and that there are resources available for those bars, but it's not an industry standard.
Alrighty. So if you're supporting a survivor or somebody discloses to you that they've been sexually assaulted or anything like sort, the most important thing is to listen and believe them. As I mentioned earlier at the beginning, a lot of times when someone discloses their assault and the person they disclose to doesn't believe them or makes them feel like it's their fault or doesn't provide the support that's needed, the chances of them, reporting or like telling someone else, they're very low because they already got a very negative response. And that's how we end up having clients that, were assaulted maybe when they were teens, early teens, or when they were early young adults. And now they're like, maybe older, 40, 50, 60, and they're having, a lot of complications in their relationship because they never got the chance to heal or work on healing from the trauma. And the reason being is that when they told someone, they didn't believe them, so they just kept it to themselves and never disclosed again. That's why it's very important when you're being a support person that you truly believe them. Keep your judgment to yourself. I know we're human, and especially if you don't do this work often, it's very easy to come up with judgments in our mind, but don't state those judgments. Give options. This one's also very important. If you have a lot of resources for them, go ahead and let them know, hey, there's all these options available. Whenever you're ready, I'm here to explore those options with you if you need that. And then you can also get your own support as a support person. If you don't know what to do, or you're not sure what to say, or you don't know how to go about the situation, you can always call our crisis line. And again, our advocates will, go through different scenarios or different ideas to help you support that person. And then, so at Monarch Services, we do have a wide variety of a lot of programs or services. We also do work around domestic violence survivors and human trafficking survivors. So again, our 24-hour crisis support line is intended for everyone and all different questions. If you are in a crisis, if you just need further information on something, or if you're looking for a particular resource, that's what our crisis line is there for. We have our 24-hour response team, or call outs as we call them. Those include the SART exams, or they're called SAFE exams now here. I'm not sure in other parts of the world, but basically, as I mentioned earlier, it's known as, you know, the rape kit, but we do not call it that. But basically, an advocate from Monarch goes to the SAFE exam with the survivor if they want an advocate there with them, and they're there to provide emotional support and help them, you know, go through that process and give further information on what are the next steps. When it comes to the SAFE exams, there's two types, at least here. There's the investigative and non-investigative. Investigative means there's a report being done with law enforcement, and there will be, you know, an investigation. And then the non-investigative is just with the Sartners and Monarch, and they don't want police involved at the moment. They can change their mind, of course. There's options. There's a lot of different options, but that's kind of the meats of non-investigative and investigative. And like I mentioned, we have crisis intervention and advocacy. They work through triggers and find healthy coping mechanisms. There's legal assistance provided with our paralegal around restraining orders. Provide counseling in schools and group homes. Of course, right now with COVID, that's not possible. It's all through Zoom or over the phone, but our children and youth program do provide the counseling at schools or group homes. That way, youth and young adults don't have to, you know, go out of their way and go to our office. We can go to them. Then of course we provide referrals to other agencies, other services. We do prevention work at our local high schools, middle schools, a lot of education around that. And then we do have our emergency confidential shelter for those who are fleeing any abusive situation. And then we have our motel services, which is sometimes an example I could think of is we have a survivor who just went through a SAFE exam. They're super long at times, and they don't have a place to go. The agency will get them a room for a night or two so they can kind of, you know, have a safe space to be at, take a shower if they wish to, and just feel comfortable and safe after going through the very invasive SAFE exam. So those are the different services we provide for survivors here in our county. And yeah.
Yeah, and if you are ever wanting to refer a survivor to Monarch Services, this crisis line number here, it is staffed 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It is bilingual. So if you are ever, you know, kind of in a situation where you are needing to refer somebody to Monarch for services, that is there for you. And also, if any of you are working in agencies, schools, anything where you're like, oh, this would be great information for us to have at our work site, or, you know, to have a training. We do these trainings on sexual assault, domestic violence, human trafficking, sexual harassment, supporting LGBTQ survivors. We have so many different, you know, kind of milieu. We also just do general agency services presentations, so you know what we do, how we do it. And so, yes, if that's something that you're interested in, please let either me or Dahlia know, and we can kind of get you set up with all of that great stuff, because we want to make sure that we get this information to as many people in our community and in as many communities as possible. So not just Santa Cruz County, if you're feeling like this could be beneficial, if you're from somewhere else and you feel like this could be beneficial for the folks that you work with. So, yeah. And so that brings us to the end of our content. So I want to open it up for any questions. And you can unmute yourself, or you can put your questions in the chat. Okay, we'll give just a few more minutes. Oh, thank you, Tracy. Thank you for being here. Okay, it doesn't look like there's any questions. So if not, then we just want to thank you all so much for being here today. We really appreciate you participating in these awareness events. Like we said before, this is Sexual Assault Awareness Month, the month of April, and there'll be a ton of different Sexual Assault Awareness Month, or SAM as we call it, events. Oh, looks like there is a question before we go. So thank you for all. I know some folks may need to go. But one question is, do you have any tips on how to react when the victim you're trying to protect is too intoxicated or not realizing they're in danger until they've sobered up? That's a great question. And sometimes, just the fact of being there with another person. So they might be, really intoxicated. We've had situations like that where somebody has been incredibly intoxicated and is not receptive to somebody trying to step in or help them, and kind of just like staying with the person at that point, like, kind of being able to stay there, even if you have to kind of stay at a distance, just to make sure that you're still support for them until they are able to be more sober and more coherent. Because that does sometimes happen. I've had situations in my own life where a friend was incredibly intoxicated and was, just hell bent on getting into a situation that was dangerous because they didn't see it because they were intoxicated. We just stayed with them. We just stayed with them until they were able to sober up, until they were able to, kind of see the situation for being dangerous. So, it's never a good idea to try to be logical with the person who is that intoxicated, but so really just being physically present with them until they're in a space where they can understand what's happening. Yeah, awesome. Wonderful. Well, thank you all so much. I see Claudia said that just wanted to invite participants to their Sexual Assault Awareness Month on behalf of the Santa Cruz Sexual Assault Response Team. That they're having virtual meetings, virtual screenings of the Bystander Moment film. Awesome. From the 16th to the 22nd. And then conversations, speakers, Jackson Katz, Sheriff Hartz. Wow, awesome. And that is on April 20th at 6 p.m. So definitely, if you all are available, then check that out. That sounds like a really fantastic event. Perfect. Well, I'll stop my share. Thank you all so much for being here. We really appreciate it.